Today we're exploring a unique paper surface called mineral paper, also known as stone paper. I'll be showing you some different techniques you can use with this paper, and I'll go over the pros and cons of choosing this surface for your watercolor paintings. Stone paper products, also referred to as bioplastic paper, mineral paper, or rich mineral paper, are strong and durable paper-like materials manufactured from calcium carbonate bonded with a high-density polyethylene resin, which is a kind of plastic. They're used in many of the same applications as cellulose-based papers. The brand I'm using today is Yasumoto Multimedia Mineral Paper. It's made in Korea. This is an 11 by 14 inch pad with 20 sheets. You can also purchase it in either a 9 by 12 or a 6 by 8 inch size. The paper weight is 100 pounds or 150 GSM, so it's quite a bit thinner than my usual 140 pound cotton watercolor paper. The company does sell a heavier weight 240 GSM version of the paper as well if you prefer heavier paper. It's a bright white, vellum-like multimedia surface, which means it can be used for watercolor, gouache, colored pencils, charcoal, pastels, alcohol ink, acrylics, pen and ink, and markers. It is not recommended for oil-based media. Mineral paper is waterproof, tear-resistant, and has no grain direction, so it offers a super smooth drawing and painting experience. Now, I decided to do several small paintings using a variety of techniques just to explore the possibilities with this paper. I cut a single sheet into 4 5 by 7 inch sheets, and it cuts like a dream, by the way. You know how when you're cutting wrapping paper and it just goes the scissors just glide. For my first painting, I wanted to see if the paper can handle masking fluid, and I also wanted to explore the paper's slick, waterproof surface by using lots of water and trying out some very wet blends. I started by sketching on this horse just using pencil. I really like the surface right away for drawing on. It's so smooth, but it has just enough grip that you don't feel like your art will easily rub off. The paper is thin enough, by the way, that you can easily trace with it using a light box. You can also print on it with any standard inkjet printer, so getting the drawing on your paper is very easy. I used a waterproof pen to outline the darkest areas like the eye and nose, and I applied my masking fluid to the areas I wanted to leave pure white. Now, once the masking fluid was completely dry, I selected 3 different paint colors just to play with: Core Ultramarine Blue Violet, Holbein Bright Rose Luminous, and Daniel Smith Quinacridone Gold. I sprayed the paper surface, totally covering it with water before dropping in some quinacridone gold. With cotton watercolor paper, the paint will spread out and soften and even absorb somewhat into the paper. But with this paper, the paint just kind of sat there and pooled. When I added my second color, my bright pink, it blended with the yellow in a puddle-like way. The surface is so smooth and unabsorbent, so if you're expecting typical wet-on-wet techniques to work here, you'll be either very surprised or very disappointed. An interesting discovery when I began incorporating the Core Ultramarine Blue Violet was that this particular paint flows way faster than the other 2 colors. You can see, even with a fairly creamy paint on my brush, it kind of just took over and pushed the other paint aside, just dominating that yellow and pink. I realized that with this much water on the surface, there's no control. You can push and pull the paint as much as you want without damaging the paper, which is great, but there is no way to get a clean, perfect gradient or a blend between the colors like you could expect with a cotton watercolor paper. I got kind of frustrated with this painting, but the good news is that you can remove the paint as many times as you need to. Redos are 100% possible with this paper. So after about 10 minutes of just messing with the colors, I decided to let it dry. I actually really loved how it dried. The paint created all of these interesting little puddle shapes, very similar to how alcohol ink looks once dry. I was able to successfully remove the masking fluid, but it was kind of tricky to remove, and it actually left an indent in the back of the paper. So I don't think I would use masking fluid on this paper again, especially considering how easy it is just to lift color back out if you need to restore the whites. I discovered that layering is only possible as long as the layer underneath is completely dry. So another 10 minutes of playing with it, and here's the final painting. As I was researching this product, I could not find any information about whether or not mineral paper can handle using a heat tool with it. So I thought I would try a couple of techniques with this next painting: a wax resist crayon to protect the whites, some alcohol spatter for texture, and seeing if a heat tool could effectively speed up the drying time between layers. I sketched on this simple toad outline. I then used the wax crayon began to draw a couple of small highlights on the toad. Now, instead of totally soaking the paper like I did in the last painting, I decided to try a more selective approach with my paint application. I just laid down blobs of color, starting with the yellow belly and then adding some darker yellow ochre to the underbelly, mouth, and eyes. I added some blues next, and because the paint was still so wet, once again the colors all kind of ran together. The way it pools can be so neat looking. I began to expect and embrace this aspect of the paper rather than fighting it, and this definitely made the experience more enjoyable. To test out the alcohol texture, I grabbed a stencil brush, dipped it in some isopropyl alcohol, and used my finger to spatter it onto the surface. The result was immediate and dramatic, really cool looking. Next, it was time to try the heat tool. Unfortunately, this was an epic fail. The heat tool caused the paper to warp and to crimp, almost like it was melting it into itself. My guess is this is due to the plastic element in the paper, so no heat tools. If you want to use this paper, you have to be very patient with the drying and just let it dry naturally. For my third and final painting, I wanted to see if it is even possible to paint something sort of realistic on this mineral paper. Given its slick, waterproof nature, I determined I would really need to be very patient, to work in small sections, and to avoid any attempt at using wet on wet techniques. Wet on dry seems to be the only approach that will result in any kind of control. For this one, I sketched a lion's face. I figured it would be easier to create a more realistic painting working with a subject that has a lot of texture and fur and detail, as opposed to something requiring more of a flat wash, which I've learned is almost impossible to do on this paper. I started with a simple round brush, just laying in some washes of color that would serve as the basic blocks of color underneath everything else. A lot of yellow ochre, some permanent violet, some ultramarine blue, and some transparent orange and burnt sienna. For the face of the lion, I started with much lighter colors, wanting to work up to my darker values more gradually, but again I used light washes of permanent violet, yellow ochre, ultramarine blue, and transparent orange, trying to keep a fairly cohesive palette for the whole thing. As I painted in the blocks of color in the face, the parts of the mane that I began with started to dry, although areas that were more wet were still forming pools of paint and color. In the drier areas, I was able to lay in more layers of color using darker values and creamier paint with a nice pointed tip of my round brush. I could also begin to lift out some color in areas of the mane where I wanted some highlights to appear. You can see because I was working more slowly with a smaller brush and less water, I was able to achieve a slightly more realistic look in the mane with lots of fur texture. For the background, I just did the best I could to lay in a flat wash of indigo. I used a grainer brush to pull the wet paint in towards the mane to create the look of the light colored hair overlapping the dark background. And then I added another layer of indigo over that background to try and smooth it out as best I could. As I've noticed with the flat washes on this particular paper, it's almost impossible to get a really smooth flat wash, but since the whole character of this painting is a little bit more loose and fresh, I thought it looked really nice next to the lion's fur. With the lion's face and mane completely dry, I was able to go back in and start to layer some more colors over the top. I have learned that I can't really layer unless I've let the layer underneath completely dry, but if you're working with small brushes and small little patches of color, it does dry really fast. I was able to use my grainer brush and a tiny little squirrel hair brush to begin adding tiny details of fur, texture, and additional layers to help darken up the face and bring it to the correct color and value. I was really happy with the overall result of this painting and thrilled to see that you can in fact paint more realistically with mineral paper. It just requires more patience, small brushes, and creamy paint. So there's the finished painting. As you can see, we were able to achieve quite a realistic look. Of course, it still has that loose painterly feel, which I think is something that the nature of this paper just encourages. And that's a lot of fun if you can embrace it. The whiskers were my final touch. This was Dr. P.H. Martin's Bleed Proof White, and I think it looks really nice. It layered beautifully on top of this paper. And you'll be surprised to see just how thin the paper is. There's absolutely no warping, wrinkling, or buckling. A little of the paint seeped underneath while I was working, but it held up so well. There's no damage to the paper at all. So to summarize, I want to talk about the different pros and cons of using mineral paper for your watercolor paintings. We'll start with the cons. As you saw, the paint can easily pool and just get out of control. You can't use a heat tool with it. Blending edges is almost impossible. Flat washes are not smooth, but they're actually kind of blobby or streaky. The paint doesn't soak in, so traditional wet and wet techniques do not work. Masking fluid is difficult to remove and causes indents in the paper. Now, let's talk about the pros of using mineral paper, and the good news is there are a lot more pros than cons. It's much cheaper than cotton watercolor paper. Currently on Amazon, a 9x12-inch pad of 20 sheets of mineral paper costs only $9.99. Compare this to a 9x12-inch pad of Arch cotton watercolor paper, which only has 12 sheets, and it costs $18.42. Also, no trees are destroyed in the making of this paper. It does not wrinkle, buckle, or warp, no matter how much water you use, which is kind of amazing. You can lift paint as much as you want without damaging the paper. It can handle both wet and dry media. The colors lose none of their vibrancy when dry, unlike some papers which can soak up the pigment and cause your paints to look dull. You can achieve some really unique and beautiful effects. You can apply multiple layers of watercolor as long as you're working wet on dry. It cuts very easily, but it's durable and tear resistant. It's transparent, can be used with a light box, and it's very lightweight. You can use wax resist and lifting to protect or restore your whites. You can make as many mistakes as you want and just wipe it clean and start over. You can also glue it onto cradled wood boards for a more finished and archival painting. The Yasumoto website recommends using Lineco PVA glue to adhere the paper to a hard surface. So although I'll admit I didn't like this paper initially, once I let go of trying to use wet and wet techniques, I found that it was actually really fun to paint on, and I was still able to achieve some pretty realistic results. Now, I've already ordered some cradled wood panels and glue to try with this paper. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see a video about that, about painting on the mineral paper and attaching it to a wood surface for a more finished framing. I anticipate many more fun painting sessions with this paper. Thanks for watching. Check out this next video and I'll see you there.